Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this first session in the inquiry into the proposed Pittlesheugh Farm battery energy storage scheme. My name is David Bouillier. I'm the reporter appointed by Scottish ministers to conduct this inquiry and to report to them with my recommendation as to whether consent under Section 36 of the Electricity Act should be granted. Today we'll be discussing landscape and visual effects. Tomorrow we will have an accompanied site inspection in the early afternoon, and in the evening there will be the community hearing session, which will give members of the community the opportunity to tell me their concerns about landscape and visual and anything else that they've mentioned that is of concern to them. Before we start the meeting proper, I need to run through the usual housekeeping arrangements. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if we discover a fire or hear an alarm or something, you can either get out the way you came in or through this door on my left. Toilets are through that door and to your right. Please ensure mobile devices are switched on to silent, please. We're recording and live streaming this event, as you probably discovered, so while we do try to avoid filming the audience, we can't guarantee that you might not feature on YouTube, so if you object to that, you need to leave now. I think we'll probably get done in the morning. We have a venue all day, so I'm in no rush, but chances are we probably will get done by lunchtime. We'll take a mid-morning break as we need it, but if anyone needs a break, and I haven't stopped, then do let me know. There's no formality. We can break whenever we feel we need to. So we'll see how we go once we get towards lunchtime. Which I usually take around about 1 o'clock, but if we're nearly done, we might want to hang on. We'll just see how everyone feels. I think that's all I had on the housekeeping side. Before we get into the meeting itself, probably best if we all introduce ourselves. So I'll start with the applicant side of the table. If you can let me know who you are and what you're doing. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, everyone.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
So that's the one thing I forgot to say. To activate the microphone, as you know, you press it. If the person who was doing it before has forgotten to press the bell button off, then you won't be able to speak. So my apologies. Yeah.
Good morning again. My name is Keith Campbell. I'm a solicitor with CMS Cameron McKenna, appearing for the applicant Pittlesheugh Farm Bess Limited. To my right is Mr. John Ingham, who is Senior Director of Landscape Planning at Stevenson Halliday, and I believe you have a hearing statement from Mr. Ingham, and he will be our principal witness this morning. Next we have Mr. Dan Grierson, who is Planning Director with NVAMS, and he's here to assist on any planning matters that may arise. And he was also the applicant's agent during the application at the Energy Consents Unit stage, and can assist with any questions in relation to that. And lastly, we have Mr. Will Ramsey, who is a director of the applicant company and the landowner of the application site. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Campbell. And I also forgot, despite kind of telling me a few minutes ago, the other important factor about pressing the button and not pressing it is the cameras will track to whoever has the microphone. So don't do what I do. Try and remember to press the button. Thank you. The council, sorry.
Good morning. My name is Sarah Thompson and I'm solicitor for Scottish Borders Council. I'm joined this morning by Joe Phillips, who's landscape architect and will be our principal witness this morning. Further down the table we have Scott Shearer, who is planning officer for Scottish Borders Council and will be here should there be any requirement to intervene on any planning matters.
Thanks, Mr. Thompson. And hopefully you know that neither Mr. Finney nor Mr. Hope could make it today, so I've had apologies from them. That, I think, is all we were expecting in terms of participants. Just for the benefit of everyone watching in the audience, there is a spare set of the plans and everything else. If anyone's interested in having a look at the drawings while we go ahead, sitting in that back corner, there's a set of the drawings and all the documents, so you can follow along. As you know, I've inspected the site already, end of last year. How it was agreed I would do an accompanied site inspection, which I mentioned earlier will be tomorrow, starting at 2 o'clock. I had hoped we could kind of arrange things today, but Mr. Hope isn't here, or indeed Mr. Biddy. Mr. Hope kindly suggested an itinerary and as a kind of starting point. So I've told him, hopefully, or my office has told him that we aim to start from here. Wherever we're going, whether it's just his route or we want to add to that, we will start here at 2 o'clock. So hopefully he gets that message. We'll find out tomorrow. Did anyone have any additions to that you wanted to make? I think that covers it.
Nothing from us, sir.
Sorry.
Oh,
I haven't actually seen the itinerary.
the itinerary.
Yes.
It's online.
No, nothing further than that.
Right. Actually, I've just asked Stillingham saying he still needs to review that itinerary, so I doubt there'll be any additions, but if there are, we'll get back to you in the course of the morning, sir.
Thank you, that's fine. Yeah, essentially it was more concerned with looking at other areas such as the vicinity of the substation, the other BES development, which is all helpful. The other site, the brownfield site that they suggested as an alternative, and a kind of drive around the general area. It wasn't focused upon, I don't think, any views specifically around the site, so whether you wanted to add any of those, that you wanted to show me anything specific, that's fine, but all we'll need to sort out at some point, well, 2 o'clock tomorrow, is how we do it, depending on how many of us are going to be there. I always try to avoid driving, so if somebody can sort out some transport, I don't need to drive, that would be great. I think that was all on site visits. I had two other probable things to raise, and I'll ask if anyone has anything else. We've been promised some revised BES guidance from the Scottish Government. I think it was due to come out in the winter. I'm not sure what the winter is, but we're still in it probably. So I suspect that might be imminent, I don't know, but obviously just in terms of timing, if it comes out after the close of the inquiry, but before I put my report in, obviously I'll need to see what you think, so further written submissions on that. If it comes out after I put my report in, it'll be up to Energy Consents to decide what to do with that. I suspect they would probably ask you again for further written submissions. So that was one thing. The other thing which I have seen, I must admit it was only yesterday, was there's some updated guidance from the National Fire Chiefs Council. I don't know if you're aware of it, but I think it came out this month, possibly January. I don't know if you've seen either. But I've only skimmed read it, I have to admit. It's quite technical rather than geared towards planning, obviously, but I suspect I may want to give you the chance to comment on that. Well, I'll probably do it anyway, just as a matter of course, because there might be something you think is important which I haven't tweaked. So I probably will be writing to you to say, what do you think of that? And that shouldn't delay the process, because that can happen in parallel to my writing up of the report. Starting with the applicant, I'll just ask if there's anything else you want to raise before we kick off.
No, nothing from us. Thank you.
No, nothing further, thank you.
Excellent, thanks. Right, so I issued an agenda in January, I think it was, and in draft form, I think it might be in December in fact, and I didn't get any suggestions of any additions to the agenda, so we'll try and stick to that reasonably closely. That doesn't mean you can't, by any means, you can't raise matters that are related to issues on the agenda that you think I've missed, or if you want to ask questions through me of parties of the opposing view, that's absolutely fine. But if we could, try and keep it fairly focused to the agenda that I set out, that means we can get through it quite speedily. I indicated in the agenda, well, in fact I put links to various documents, plans and things that at the time were the most up-to-date set of drawings that we had, and I think they are still the most up-to-date drawings of the proposal, but since I issued the agenda there have been some more drawings come in terms of cross-sections, ZTVs and some updated photo montages, which are all very helpful. So I've not mentioned those in the agenda, but obviously we'll need to refer to them. I think I said, or I think Chris in the office possibly told you that the applicants a very helpful list of foundation and supporting documents, which is hyperlinks to everything we might need to look at, would be a good thing to have open, because we can make sure we're looking at the same version, and we can hopefully navigate to things quite quickly, so it'd be useful if you could have that available. I think that was it on documents. Yeah, I think so. So the first point on the agenda was just to look at the proposal itself. I wasn't proposing to spend a massive amount of time because we know what's proposed, but it's just to, because the scheme has changed a couple of times, just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of the latest proposal for which consent is sought. So the first document I suggest we have a quick look at using the applicant's list of documents is numbered 008015, which is the general layout of the proposal. I'm hoping that everyone looking at the same document simultaneously won't slow everything down horrendously. We'll soon find out. Wi-Fi seems very good here, actually. So, oh yeah, very good, very quick. Appreciate it's never ideal looking at things on a screen. Obviously, if you've got a paper copy, feel free to use it. But, so obviously the scheme has been amended a couple of times, moving away from the burn out of the flood zone and reducing the size of, changing the shape of the compound and amending the design of the bunds. Really just a factual question for the applicant, I guess. I'm conscious of stating him. I think you came into this process later on. I think you weren't the original designer, but I'm looking at you to tell me what I need to know about the proposal. In terms of the height, if we look at, say, at the northern bund first, what sort of height are we talking about, looking at these contour lines? Maybe this isn't the best drawing to look at, maybe one of the cross sections might be actually better, but it strikes me. So the field seems to drop down to a contour line of about 75-ish. And then, to what height is that northern bund rising up? Is it in the region of 79, so about 4 metres, or slightly more than that maybe? Oh yeah.
Yes, sorry, can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, so the contours in the field actually start up near 75, near the C81 at the top, and drop down to close to 68 metres, 67.5 metres at the bottom end of the field.
Right, so very far, yes.
At the bottom of the field. And then if we're referring to the southern bund there, that rises up to, those are actually half-metre contours.
Okay.
So you can see the red one there is 75, hopefully that one's visible, and then they rise up to about 77 metres.
Right.
At the very top, the very highest bit.
So that's southern bund, we'll look at that first, and we're looking at, compared with the natural ground level as it stands at the moment, around about 8 metres or thereabouts?
Unfortunately, that contour plan doesn't show the existing ground level at the point where the, it's probably around about 69 metres at that point, so probably rising up to 8.5 to 9 metres.
Right.
I think it's 8.5 metres stated in the documents.
Yes, I think that's... I'll get the hang of these. I've only been using these for about 16 years. I'll get the hang of them eventually. I think, Ms Phillips, that was, I think, the ballpark figure you were saying 8.5 metre kind of bunds, is that right? Yeah.
Is that right, bud? Yeah, correct.
Am I right to say the northern bund is a wee bit smaller, maybe not quite as small as I said, but it looks, or it's shallower anyway. The contour lines appear to be somewhat more spaced on its outside edge anyway.
That's correct. The northern bund is much shallower, and that's a function of the fact that the land is falling at that point, but still relatively high. So again, you can see the contours immediately adjacent to that are around about 75 metres, and then they rise to close to 75 metres there. There's a little bit of a small gully, I suppose, on that northern edge. But yeah, it's otherwise a very shallow gradient up to that northern boundary.
Ms Phillips, you contend that northern boundary, that northern bund is a lot flatter.
Yeah, it's graded more shallowly, but on the western side it looks to go to a height of about 4 metres and then tapers a bit, so it's more like 2.5 at its kind of lowest height.
Yes, apologies, that's correct. At the very western end of it, the bund, yes, I'm happy with that.
Yeah, that's fine. Where the access comes in, there's a
Correct.
steeper bit. Yeah, understood. Yeah.
Could I just, might be helpful just to give a general context of what I was trying to achieve, was to have the whole, all of the units, the whole scheme to be hidden, and so that has required some digging out and putting the dugout area onto the bunding. And then in the latest plan, the idea was to retain as much cropping of the arable land as possible. And so that's why the northern area is flatter gradient, so that cropping can still happen and the combines and the tractors can still drive onto that northern bunding. Unfortunately, on the southern bund, there's not enough room to be able to do that, partly because of SEPA's requirement to be outside of the floodplain.
Okay, so I refer to various of the drawings. I don't think we necessarily need to go through them unless anyone wants me to specifically. So we've got cross-section drawings, a plan showing where the cross-sections were taken, drainage plan, I'm not too interested in that. The actual electrical kit within the yard, within the site, I appreciate is indicative in terms of you want to retain the ability to, obviously, to select whichever is the most appropriate at the time you were to do it. But I think we're looking at an indicative height of the battery packs of about 3.3 metres or thereabouts, and the transformer being at most about 7 metres, which I think is broadly consistent with the updated ZTVs. Again, you've used an indicative height in those. I think my note says about 3 metres and up to about 6.6 metres for the kit. So I suppose it's a question for the council. Yeah, we don't know what precisely the kit will be, but are you satisfied that the ZTV or the ZTVs that relate to the electrical kit within the yard are based upon a reasonable impression of what the height of those might be, maximum height?
Yes, I am, but I also have an issue with the fact that a ZTV hasn't been run without the earth bund, and that relates to a point that comes up in my hearing statement around construction effects. That unless that bund is the first phase in the construction, that will be there essentially all the way through the construction, then there will be points within that phase in which there will be greater visibility than is represented in the ZTVs.
Thank you. This might be a question for the applicant. In terms of the construction process, and you talked about the bunds are formed by digging down the site. Is it the case that the bunds would go in first because of that process?
It is. I mean, Will has, from day one, intended to put the bunds in as soon as possible, certainly in advance of construction work within the compound, to hide the construction works. That's been mentioned all the way through the process. And just while I'm on, just to confirm, the height of the units, 3.3 metres, the height of the house is actually quite tall. I mean, I've worked on quite a lot of these, and generally they're trending at sort of up to 3 metres or slightly less. So this is, this is a safe height to work things on. One other point to make regarding the transformers, from an early stage, to say the site's been designed from day one to be concealed by the perimeter bunding. There are 3 transformers rather than one big one, because that allows you to put in smaller kit. single transformers on the typical BES are usually the tallest and most visible component within the project. So in this case, by using the 3 smaller ones, the largest object is quite significantly reduced in height.
So, Mr. Phillips, do you accept that, Mr. Phillips, that it looks like the plan is to dig the site out, and therefore what's within there ought to be hidden by the bunds, albeit without any vegetation on them, I guess, initially? Do you accept that?
I think even within that first phase where you've got the heavy plant to do the muck shift and going to the Echoes 1 Best site and looking at what that appears like, you can see that there's still an associated impact with a heavy plant and the muck shift, even in the construction of the bunds. That's assuming that would be the first phase and it would be intact and in place to screen all subsequent construction, which I'm not sure the practicalities of that, because you can see that the bund on that north face is really tight to where you would be bringing in the battery packs, same on the kind of southern side. I'm not sure about the practicalities of that.
Thank you, sir. I think just a first point to recognise that there will of course be a construction phase to this development, and the applicant accepts that. There will be related construction phase effects. In terms of the ZTV, which was going back to your original question, sir, the reality is the platform upon which the kit sits has to be constructed, and the earthworks have to be constructed. It's a practical function of the design of the layout of the scheme that has to be constructed. So all of the earthworks have to be constructed before any of the kit can be brought in. So it isn't the case that I see no purpose in running a ZTV for the kit without the earthworks in place, because that scenario would never occur.
On the broader point, Mr. Phillips, I think, was critical that GLVI3 would expect you, would it not, to assess construction stage effects, particularly if it's going to take a year. I think that's a reasonable guess, about a year for construction. You'd accept you haven't done that?
12 months is, yes, what's been stated.
Presumably, not for only part of that 12 months would what was going on within the compound be as obvious. There'll be a diminution of, it'll be shock and awe on day one when you start ripping the site up. But once the bunds have gone in, which you're saying is going to happen relatively early in the process, after that, whatever you're up to inside the compound will be less visible. Presumably have you got an idea of relative duration of, how long that most visible construction phase of the 12 months, how long that's likely to take?
Well, assuming this is reference to the creation of the bunds, weather conditions obviously play a part. You don't want to be doing it if it's very wet and you have potential for runoff, but in good conditions, experience elsewhere, maybe 3 months.
Another question on the ZTV, just for my own education. I appreciate that they're not bare earth ZTVs. They do take account of buildings, I think, and bigger vegetation. I just wondered what your data source, how you do them. What do you rely on to get that data on buildings and other things?
Yes, so with reference specifically to the ZTVs, which I submitted in January, those ones are not bare earth ZTVs, as you say. They incorporate LiDAR data, and the source for that data is on the bottom of the ZTVs themselves, actually. But terrain data, LiDAR, for reference, it's LiDAR Phase 3 derived DSM data. I confess it's one of my GIS colleagues who produces these, but in essence what that does, it takes from satellite data, it takes the height of buildings and anything that it can pick up over 2 meters in height is the data. So we filter out everything that's below 2 meters in height. So what that means is these ZTVs will typically pick up blocks of woodland, tree copses perhaps, and in some cases also hedgerows where they are over 2 meters in height. Typically though we find that most of these ZTVs don't pick up the screening effect of hedgerows though, because either they're maintained below 2 meters in height or the data perhaps isn't quite at sufficient granular detail to pick up an individual hedgerow.
I suppose you're content that the methodology they've used is, you know, is something you'd be able to rely upon.
Yeah, I'm happy with the ZTVs. There's a point around hedgerows that we might come on to later. And there's an assumption that within the winter months, the hedgerows provide an effective screen. Driving through this morning and previously on my site visit, you can see that's not the case. Definitely they provide a partial screen, but you still get a filtered view through to the site.
I was also thinking about hedgerows this morning because I was driving in, and I had a question for you on that. From the actual perspective of the driver, it struck me that even at this time of year, when viewed at an oblique angle, they're actually quite effective screens. Would you accept that? It's when you turn to actually look, then you can see through them very clearly. I'm just thinking in terms of assessing the effects on mitigating visual effects for people moving fairly fast, because you're looking ahead. Do you accept that oblique view through a winter hedge is actually quite well screened?
Yeah, I do, but as well, there's reference to the road on the northern side. I think it's C81, where the thought is that's an effective screen on that road. Traffic would potentially be driving that little bit slower. I agree with your point that it's at that perpendicular angle that it becomes more transparent, but also with the undulations of the landform, there are points where you can see over the hedgerows, plus in higher vehicles, depending on the management and the bolstering of hedgerows or whatever, but there is, in lorries or buses or whatever, you will see over the hedgerows.
Anything from this side of the table on hedges? Maybe a question for future management of the hedges. I know farmers always seem to keep the hedges at a certain height. I don't know if there's any rules about that, or just custom, but I think some of the visualizations we'll look at later on, there was a suggestion that they could actually be left to attain a greater height, which I assume doesn't cause any problems from an agricultural point of view. But just if there's anything you want to say about hedgerows and perhaps what you've already done in terms of gapping up and things like that, which I confess I haven't gone and had a look at, but if you know, whatever you want to say on that.
Perhaps if I start, I'm not qualified to comment on how the landowner here manages the hedgerows at the moment, and perhaps I'll pass over to my colleague Mr. Ramsey there in a moment. But in general terms, I accept the point that hedgerows in winter months, such as the ones in the landscape here, don't provide a complete screen when you're stood there looking through a hedgerow. I also agree with the point that you make, that as you're driving along, it's quite hard to focus on anything through the hedgerow. Your eye naturally focuses on the foreground hedgerow vegetation, and so whilst in theory you might be aware in your peripheral vision maybe that there's something behind that hedgerow, the heavily filtered nature of that means that it's not a primary focus of your attention.
And just to add, yes, we have left it now for about 18 months of not being cut all around the three sides that have the hedgerows, and we'll carry on doing that as long as it doesn't become too tall and wispy, and probably lorry height window is the height that we might cut it to.
Sorry, if I could just add one final point to that. Of course, that could be set out in a landscape management plan for the site. So that is something that could be conditioned if it was felt that a particular height of the hedgerow, that could be written into a management plan, which would then obviously be agreed as a condition with the council.
while we're talking about hedges, just because I'll probably forget otherwise, it was a question for Mr. Ramsey really, because it's a land ownership question. The field on the other side of the Laprig Burn, is that one of yours as well? No. Okay. I had a question because it relates to a point the council will come on to about visibility from that other minor road living across that field and whether we could control. The answer is no, because that's not your field. That's fine. Thank you. Maybe we could, on the ZTVs, have a look at drawing or file 008027, which is the cumulative ZTV with the consented and under construction development. I was struck by how little overlap there is between the two view sheds. On the one hand, the existing Bess development and the things around the substation, and on the other hand, what you might see of this development. Question for the applicant really is, does that not support the council's point that by the time you get to your site, you've left behind the Bess at the substation and the Bess development around it, and you're into a landscape where you can no longer see that, and that therefore amplifies the effect of what you now want to do. Do you accept that?
Sorry, as you say, that cumulative ZTV does illustrate quite a strong physical barrier between the site and if we call it the cluster around the Eccles substation. So from our perspective, I do see it as lying within a slightly different pocket of the landscape to the cluster around the Eccles substation there. I don't think it really supports a case that it's spread out. I think the effects are quite localised to the Pittlesheugh Bess project, and there is a localised effect there. And then there's a separate localised effect around the Eccles substation. I don't think they combine to generate an effect across the wider landscape. I think they need to be viewed as two separate pockets of effects.
Ms. Phillips, did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, there's a sequential effect which is just as important as a combined effect, and possibly more important in this respect, that we've got that clustering with the existing substation. And you can see from the ZTV there's an influence to the north and then this influence to the south. So this is one area where you might get respite or some kind of relief from the influence of development, and that raises its susceptibility to new development. So yeah, and it's sort of seen as the spread of development into a new landscape where currently the character is defined by the rural landscape. So it's a spread of that development, and the fact that we've got that clustering there almost increases the cumulative effect.
I understand. We'll come back to that in a bit when we talk about the effects in more detail, but would you accept that the extent of theoretical visibility for this proposal is far less than the theoretical visibility of what's there at the moment or consented?
It's definitely, Pittlesheugh, this Bess has very localised effects, but what I would say about the other developments, they're better located in the sense that they are attached to something, so there's landform enclosing them, there's existing woodland, so there's some kind of enclosure to those developments that helps to settle them into the landscape in a way. Whereas in contrast, the development we have here feels quite exposed in the open landscape. and that there's no, it's not attached to anything, that there's no woodland or there's no distinct landform that would give that natural screening you'd be looking for in locating that scale of development.
Thank you. Oh, I would take the applicant's side, or put words in their mouth, but I suspect they will say, well, there will be screening. It may be not natural screening. It's not lateral landform. It's not woodland, but there will be alteration to the contours of the land that will perform a very effective screening role. They will say, I know we'll come on to what the effects of looking at the bunds will be, because I know that's a concern to you, because they're not a natural feature. But just in terms of being able to see the kit, you know, the very obviously engineered, man-made, hard mechanical stuff. Do you accept that, albeit in a natural form of screening, it will, or it is likely to be screened quite effectively by the proposed bund?
What I'd say around the siting of development in the landscape, it's useful if there's a logic to it. So with the other BES developments, there's a logic to it because there's a substation and they're close to substation, so we're redefining the character of that landscape. There's no apparent logic in this location. I would say yes, that the bund has been shown to ultimately provide an effective screen, but once we've seen the construction, there's a perception element. We know that there's a large scale development there. So yeah, you could plant a forest around it and never see it, but people living in this local area know that there's a development there and it's changed the perception of that landscape, even though visibility is not apparent.
Thank you, sir. I think there's a few points to address there. Just address the final one there about perception versus actual landscape and visual effect. I think as we don't seem to be very far apart on the fact that we agree that this is a very localised effect. And when we look at that ZTV there, it actually exaggerates quite substantially still the actual visual effect of the scheme. We'll perhaps get on some of the detail of this a bit later on, but my position is that essentially the scheme is only really visible from the roads immediately surrounding the field and the one running down to Crosshole Farm. I do consider that to be a very localised effect, and I would say perception of there being something there is not the same as actually being able to see something. We are aware that something's there, but that doesn't necessarily affect your appreciation of the landscape and your appreciation of the views. In terms of the site itself and the suggestion that there are no natural features of the landscape which are well suited to this, I do disagree here, because the landform of the site itself, in my opinion, actually is well suited to the site, because the very fact that it drops down to the bottom of the field and the location of where the bunds have been created, they are at the very lower part of the field there, and actually the landform there, in my opinion, helps to assimilate that scheme into the site. So I don't actually consider it to be a particularly exposed field. I actually consider it to be low down and really only visible through the hedgerows along the boundaries of the site, and as we talked about, that road running down to Crosshole Farm. So yes, there's the screening provided by the bund, but in addition to that, there's the natural screening offered by the topography of the landscape and also the hedgerows, which aren't covered as we've touched on already in terms of the ZTV. So yeah, those are just a few points.
I'd like to come back, and I have a question for you as well, which you can think about. I understand what you're saying about the perception. Even if you can't see it, if you're local, you will know it's there. It will always be in your mind, particularly, and we'll hear that tomorrow, I suspect. People have concerns about this type of thing and the fact that they know it's there. But is that for me as a non-landscape architect, is that perception, is that a legitimate visual effect, or is it a landscape character effect, or is it something else? And is it something that GLVIA 3 specifically refers to? I'm not saying that's the Bible that we have to follow, because obviously it's just guidance, but you know, is it how do I slot that in my report to ministers? Obviously I'll be talking about the concerns that local people have, but how do I describe that perception of knowing something is there even though you can't see it? How does that all fit in together?
Well, there's another aspect to this argument in the fact that the applicant may well effectively screen the development, but they've replaced the visibility of the development with the visibility of a bund. So although we might not see the development, we know that's there and that is an issue, but we're seeing a bund that will appear incongruous in the natural landscape, in the natural landform, and that becomes the main effect really, where we've got in one corner a slope that's in excess of a small property up to 8.5 metres, which is quite a substantial landform that will not look natural within that landscape. And it's shown in the visualisations, but I think the reality will be a lot starker than what the visualisations are showing. There's also an issue around the effectiveness of bunds, and this is something I've come up against in other projects where we've proposed bunds, where they're no longer attached to the water table, so you've got potentially a risk of bunds drying out. So whilst in the visuals they're shown green and lush and as if the vegetation is thriving, there are issues around potential erosion in heavy rainfall, potential drought in periods of low rainfall, and I would be interested to know where's the guarantee that those bunds will be an effective measure in screening the development. Thank you.
So is it fair to say that if they were able to do the bunds really well, that would lessen your concerns? I'm not saying you will ever accept that they could do them well enough, but you know, is it the relative success of the bunds at blending into the landscape and not in themselves causing visual harm that is the kind of key determining factor as to whether you think the visual effect or the landscape effect could ever be acceptable? Is that the issue?
Yeah, the landform, the shape of the bund is an issue. That issue would be compounded if those bunds were ineffective and if you had green all around and they were looking brown and parched, or you know, they were eroded in parts. So I'm saying there's an issue with the bunding which would be exacerbated if they don't work effectively.
I'm struggling to think of a case of a development site which has bunds other than fairly horrendous bunds, you know, old school bunds, which, you know, this isn't. Can you help me either on the? I'd like to hear about the point about future maintenance, erosion, drought, etc. Are there any other sites you can think of where this more, you would say, subtle bunding has been done and has been shown to be successful?
My experience prior to joining my current company actually was as landscape restoration manager for a minerals company. So I spent several years working on the restoration of earth bunds and that sort of thing. My experience is, and we're not talking here about a lot of trees and trees, there are pockets of that, but actually what we're talking about here for the most part is native meadow grassland across there, which is more than, the gradients on here are more than acceptable for that sort of habitat to be established. Even in the early phases of the development, as that vegetation is establishing, I think we need to bear in mind that we are in an arable landscape here, where you will see, I'm sure as we drive around the site, that a number of the fields are currently bare at the moment. So even in the early phases, as that vegetation is establishing, that isn't in itself uncharacteristic bare earth. isn't uncharacteristic within the landscape.
You can't think of any example of, I'm not volunteering to travel around the world to look at a bun, but you can't off the top of your head think of an example of something where this type of approach has been taken or applied successfully that I might be able to look at.
Well, actually, sir, it's probably worth noting that if you drive down to the Eccles substation, there's a number of earth buns around that substation already, which I don't know the history exactly when they were established, but they're of a similar gradient to those proposed, and the vegetation there is, you know, perfectly established.
There's an example, I don't know the name of the site, but it's Dalkeith Country Estate, and it's on the kind of southeast side. There's a landfill in there that I sometimes pass, and it's probably, it's quite high, it's probably similar to the 8.5 metres, and fairly steep. It's effective in the sense that there's trees establishing on it, but in terms of coming back to that point about perception, it makes you suspicious or curious to know what is inside that bund that, okay, you don't see the development, but it definitely looks unnatural and incongruous in that rural landscape.
Is that, in terms of relative proximity to the road compared with this, are they kind of the same sort of ballpark? Yeah.
No, the road's right tight to the bund, so you get that a kind of very immediate impression.
Kind of a shock factor. You go, what's hiding behind there? Okay.
Excuse me, if I could add, I mean, the intention is to soften the buns as much as possible with, in addition to the, the grassland on the northern shallow bund, which will be, mainly retained in cultivation, pockets of native woodland here and there, native woodland and scrub, plants such as gorse and broom survive very well on well-drained soils and would be, appropriate here. I was thinking as hard as I could about local examples of buns and earthworks with trees on them, and nearly came with Roxburgh Castle, which is earthworks and buns of some antiquity, but well planted and covered in well-established surviving woodlands. So in those conditions, that's worked well. Clearly, planning conditions would require ongoing maintenance and replacement of any failed planting as appropriate, and ongoing watering and drought conditions if appropriate. But I think avoiding die-off and drought can be avoided by using appropriate species.
Yeah, I just have a question. I'm curious to know a little bit more about where the slopes have been made shallower so that we can retain the agricultural use. But surely if that's made land, it's prone to compaction. Like those soils, if there's been a big earthworks operation, we've made those slopes shallower, and then we're using farm machinery or whatever on to cultivate those parts of the slope. My thinking or my understanding would be that land would then be prone to compaction, which isn't great for agriculture or the quality of the soils.
I think this comes down to soil management, which again is something which could be conditioned a soil management plan. Ms Phillips is absolutely correct that if it's not done correctly, the compaction of the soil can occur. But again, in my previous job as landscape restoration manager at a minerals company, we restored numerous sites to agricultural land, very productive arable land as well. So it is possible. It's a case of handling the soils correctly at the time the soil is stripped, making sure that it's stored in at appropriate heights, not mixing the various topsoils with the subsoils, and then replacing it, ripping it, cultivating it properly. It might take a year to re-establish it properly, but it is perfectly achievable with appropriate soil management.
Okay, so I wasn't going to look at the photo montages yet because we'll deal with those later on, probably when we're looking at visual effects. So I wanted to go on to the questions about methodology, which I think many of which have kind of been answered, because I think the parties are not massively apart on the adequacy of the methodology. I have the Council's point about the absence of construction stage effects, of course. But apart from that, I think there's general agreement about the size of the study area, no need to look at landscape effects beyond this landscape character type. I think parties are agreed on that. Selection of 4 viewpoint locations, generally okay, although I know the Council has suggested a couple of other spots that could have been chosen which might have been more representative or possibly more more significant views might have, and we'll come to that in a second. But am I fair to, apart with the exception of the construction stage effects, is it fair to say, Ms Phillips, that you're generally content that the methodology is appropriate?
Yeah, I think, I'm relatively okay with the methodology. It's not always been applied effectively within the assessment, but we'll probably come on to that. Thank you.
Okay, so I wanted to move on to landscape effects. The site sits within the Lowland with Drumlins LCT. Nature Scott has obviously, as it has done everywhere, carried out an assessment. One of the descriptions of the LCT they've used is densely settled, which I know, Ms Phillips, you don't think is perhaps reasonable, or it's going a bit too far. Can you just explain that a bit further?
Yeah, if I hear the term densely settled, I'm thinking of a built-up area. That's normally the context within which that term would be used. So I think it's inappropriate to describe the landscape, that 2 kilometre study area in which we're looking at.
I accept if you take the comparison of an urban area to a rural area. Clearly, it isn't an urban area. It's not it's not densely settled in the sense it's an urban area. I would say I would certainly say that it wasn't sparsely settled though. This isn't a sort of wildland landscape, for example. It is somewhere in between. I would say for a rural area, it's moderately settled. I don't think we're very far apart on that point.
I think everyone accepts it. It's not. There's no wildness. It's an obviously human-influenced landscape. That's not to say it's unattractive, but it's perhaps that's what they were getting at when they said. Although densely seems to have a meaning. But anyway, we can agree it's settled. Perhaps is as far as we're going to get. Miss.
I think there needs to be a distinction made between settled and developed. Settled is a term that references settlement, human habitation, and in that respect it's sparsely settled. I do accept that there is some degree of development with the agricultural complexes in the area, but it's a different type of development.
Do you accept that settled ought really to refer to settlements rather than to sort of evidence of human presence?
I was just thinking, trying to think that through as. I'm not sure I entirely agree. Settlement doesn't necessarily mean settled. Settled doesn't immediately. I think landscapes throughout history have been settled. That doesn't necessarily mean there have been settlements. So I think a landscape can be moderately densely settled, even though they may be a series of individual units scattered across a landscape. And I think in terms of this landscape here, I think we can't avoid the fact that there are a number of fairly large utilitarian agricultural units in that landscape as well. So there is an element of modern settlement to the landscape. I agree, it's not there's not a large settlement as such, though. Yeah.
We'll come on. Well, in fact, we'll come on now to what it talks about: pylons, large-scale barns, and silos being prominent. And I think you can tell me what you think about whether they are prominent or whether they're sort of separate features within the landscape. But I think you both agree that the presence of those features detracts or reduces the value of the landscape. You may disagree with the extent to which it does that, but I think you both agree that they do detract from the value. I think the main difference between you is as to how that affects the susceptibility of the landscape to any further such development. I'll start with Ms. Phillips, maybe. Just is that fair? They do detract from the landscape, these modern big farm sheds and the John Deere thing down the road, which is fairly prominent, and the silos and things, and the pylons, of course, except that they reduce the value of the landscape, but perhaps not so far as the applicant thinks they do. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd agree that they do, but ultimately the landscape is still defined by its rural character, and that's the kind of the critical bit, the bit that we're trying to hold on to make sure we're not tipping that balance. So at the moment, the pylons, the agricultural buildings, the extents are limited enough, the influence is limited enough that they appear as features within a rural landscape rather than the defining elements of that landscape.
In terms of value, how do you accept that? Do you think that the pylons and the other bits of modern life are not, they are features that you have to live with, but they don't degrade the value of the landscape because you still see it as a nice rural place?
I think they're a factor in considering landscape value. So in terms of GLVIA 3 and also so you'll be aware of the technical guidance note on assessing landscape value outside of national landscapes. So in there is a suggestion that built infrastructure is an indicator of lower sensitivity, lower value. Now, what I would say is I do think that they are an indicator of lower value. They do have an impact on landscape value, but they are just one factor, and it's certainly not the defining feature which tips it from being a high value landscape into a low value landscape. I think there's other factors which come into that as well. So with reference to this table 1 in that technical guidance note there, that it sets out a series of factors, and yes, landscape detracts is one factor, but it's not the only one. And I think when you work through all of those, as indeed the original LVIA does do, I concur that the value of the landscape there, we say it's medium-low value. What I would say, sir, is that, so as you know, this wasn't my own LVIA originally. I tend to use the words national, regional and community value rather than high, medium, low. And the reason for that being, we acknowledge, we all acknowledge that all landscapes matter. They're all valued to some degree by different people. There's just different levels of value. And what I would say here is I completely accept that this is a locally valued landscape. It's community value, but I see no factors which elevate it above being of that level.
Final point on the value, you accept that there is no designation, not even a local designation in this landscape. I think that's right. You'd accept that.
Yeah, except that there's no designation covering this landscape. In terms of that hierarchy with respect to value, with a high value, as you were making the point, high value is normally attributed to a national level landscape. Medium high would typically be attributed to a regional landscape. But then it's like the community values slipped a rung and has gone to medium low rather than medium. When we look at the bottom end of the spectrum, low would typically be a degraded landscape, which there aren't really many of them in Borders as a kind of comparative, but that would be the low. So that leaves you those two rungs to choose from, medium or medium low. There's a difference of opinion. I would say the community level warrants a medium value rather than medium low.
Moving on to susceptibility, because I think this is where you're more further apart, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my non-expert summary is the applicant's position is the presence of things like pylons actually reduces the susceptibility to further harm from what is now proposed, whereas the council has the opposite view that in fact susceptibility is increased because you need to hang on to the nicer bits, putting it very crudely. I'll start maybe with the applicant. That's a terribly crude way of putting it, but is that accurate, how I've tried to summarise it?
I think you've captured the difference in opinion between Ms Phillips and myself on this point. Yes, our position my position is that these features do to an extent detract from the landscape. So that they are a factor in determining landscape susceptibility. Again, as with value, it is just one factor. So it's not the overall, it's not the single factor which is determining our judgment here about landscape susceptibility. But I'm afraid I disagree with Ms Phillips' position that the presence of those features in the landscape, those existing features in the landscape, somehow increase the susceptibility. And I was trying to think, the converse of that position is presumably that wild land or land that doesn't have modern influences in it would be of lower susceptibility to the form of development we're talking about here. So I think only if there was a landscape policy or a landscapes capacity study or landscape sensitivity study which indicated that we were about to breach a threshold of the character here, that might be a factor taken into account here. But I'm certainly of the opinion that we're not at a tipping point of capacity here in this landscape, which means that it reduces susceptibility. I think landscape and visual, all of the landscape and visual impact assessments I've ever been involved with and reviewed hundreds of them, I've not seen this position before where it's suggested that it increases the susceptibility to further development.
Can you refer us to somewhere that would kind of support your views on, is there anything in LVIA3 or anywhere else, or maybe just previous experience of taking that stance? And I want you also to respond to the inverse scenario of wild land in terms of susceptibility. You know, if there's nothing there that's already caused harm, what do you say to Mr. Gibbons' view? Well, that must mean that susceptibility is reduced, if that's the inverse of what you're saying. No.
So what we have here is a methodology that triple counts the impact of development in the landscape. So we've already agreed that the presence of the pylon, for example, is reducing the value. We're also saying that the presence of the pylon is reducing susceptibility. We're also saying, when we get onto magnitude of change, that the presence of the pylon is increasing the magnitude of change. So when we add all that up, if there's development in the landscape, the methodology is restricted to lead to one conclusion, that it's going to be a minor effect, because we're saying that in every respect, the presence of that pylon line or the development is making it more acceptable for the development to be part of that landscape. And in my mind, that's not a balanced methodology, because you create the thin end of the wedge, where once you've got one development, it opens up a local landscape where there's no designations to another development, and then we've got two developments, and again, that compounds the situation, and you're into a downward spiral. So there has to be some recognition that the development in that landscape is in some way causing harm, or is adversely affecting what we're ultimately all trying to protect, which is the rural character of that landscape. I think with susceptibility, with GLVII3 and its application, it's very much on a case-by-case basis, and you apply the methodology in an appropriate way to different contexts. So I think what we're suggesting there in terms of susceptibility is absolutely appropriate for this context. Otherwise, the outcome that I was describing is inevitable, where of course we're going to get development, and then we're going to get more development. In respect of wildland, that's got an especially high value because there's no development, so it's kind of protected to the value. Susceptibility, I think inevitably based on landscape character, would also be high in that context, because everyone would agree that it wouldn't be appropriate to have a BES within wild land. So yes, susceptibility can cut both ways, but you need to know ultimately how the methodology is working to best protect what we're trying to preserve.
I think we need to be quite careful we're not tipping into a consideration of landscape capacity here, and conflating the concept of landscape capacity with landscape susceptibility. There is no capacity study for this area, but I mean, from my personal opinion, we're not at a stage where this is a landscape which doesn't have capacity for this form of development. I'm aware that this document isn't in the foundation list, so I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to discuss it or not, but it is a NatureScot document, so it is available if you want it. But in there, it's landscape sensitivity assessment guidance from NatureScot, and in there is an example that they set out of this, and if I could just scroll down, it's on page 22 of this document under perceptual aspects. It does say, in general, landscapes which are more modified and development, I'll read this again. In general, landscapes which are more modified and developed are likely to be less susceptible, while landscapes with a distinct sense of wildness or timelessness will be more susceptible. So I think the NatureScot position there, I should stress that that's an example of somebody else's LVIA, but it's just to illustrate a point that NatureScot appears to be taking that position. Landscape capacity is a completely separate issue, and I'm not drawing a judgment here about what the capacity of the Merse landscape is overall, but I don't think there's anything there to suggest that we are at a tipping point of capacity.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, just on more of a technical point, I think from our understanding is that there's been a shift away from capacity studies, more particularly in the assessment of wind energy proposals. But certainly the council does have a wind energy capacity study that is appended to our renewable energy SPG. However, we have had or been instructed that most of that is to be set aside because the shift is towards sensitivity studies. We are in the process of updating that document to basically change it into a sensitivity study. But yeah, in terms of a capacity study, the council doesn't presently have one. It's specifically not one in relation to BES.
You're right. they've become frowned upon, capacity studies of late, or they weren't getting much traction at appeals, I think. So are you saying that susceptibility and sensitivity are kind of, if not synonymous, but they're talking about the same thing, in that the more of something harmful you put in an area, the more sensitive it becomes? I'm a northern landscape architect, so I like to blur all the terms, but even if susceptibility were not the right phrase or the right place for this factor to be slotted into the assessment process, my understanding is that whether you call it susceptibility or sensitivity, the very presence of other less than ideal stuff makes the landscape either more susceptible or more sensitive to doing more of it. Is that kind of where you're coming from?
When we've put our comments together around this topic of susceptibility, we're not proposing it's high susceptibility. We're saying, you know, it's possibly medium high. So there's a balance in that, where we're saying, yeah, it's a modified landscape. It's not your wild land. It's not rating as a high susceptibility, but we're thinking about the vulnerability of that landscape to this type of development, and it's also the influence of the cluster of developments around the substation, which does form part of the baseline. So it's not just the cumulative assessment when we start to think about those. They're already there, they're forming part of the baseline. We've got operational, we've got under construction, and so it's within that context that the susceptibility of the site we're looking at, both in terms of landscape character, but people's visual experience of that landscape, the susceptibility is raised because there's this expansion of development and this potentially harmful threat that's expanding into a new landscape.
Is it, again, I'm showing my non-landscape architect credentials, but is it in any way synonymous with arguments around wind farms, where you might have one wind farm, then you can have another one, because, you know, there's been a recognition that wind farms are present, but there comes a point where it ceases to become a landscape with wind farms, it becomes a wind farm landscape. That's an extreme end of the scale, but is it a similar sort of argument that you can have too much, you can maybe tolerate so much of a bad thing, but once you get to a certain threshold, or the closer you get to whatever point is too much, the harder it gets to accommodate more of that thing within the landscape without causing harm? Is that kind of a very crude way of putting it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's recognised, while it's not a high value landscape, that currently the type of development, the agricultural development is of a certain type, which isn't necessarily industrial. It's kind of, there's a logic to it, it's associated with the agricultural use of that landscape, and that the proposed location, so it comes back to the location, the landscape character, that it forms a breach from where the existing developments are being clustered. It draws that influence into a new area where currently that influence does not exist.
I think we've already established that I disagree with the position presented by the council. My understanding is from Ms Phillips's hearing statement is that her position is that this is a medium to high sensitive landscape, which, in my opinion, is just far too high. This I've said that I understand that it's of community value. But ultimately, I do not think that this is any greater than medium to low sensitive landscape. And what I would say is, I think when you look at the characteristics of the landscape, there are certain elements of it which are well suited to this form of development. Now, if we were proposing a BES project on one of the tops of the drumlins or on one of the ridges of the landform, I think that would clearly be a different scenario. But what we're talking about here is this is a landscape which does have a landform which is relatively well suited to the form of development proposed. In the absence of those national or regional local designations, when you look at the various other characteristics of the landscape and how susceptible they are, I feel very strongly that a medium-high sensitivity rating for this is far too high for the landscape.
We're getting through landscape effects, and we'll pause for a break before we go to visual. But in terms of magnitude change at the site level, I think parties are in agreement that there would be a high magnitude of change. I think the applicant would say, well, obviously because it's a major engineering project in a field, and I mean, I think the council would accept that. Again, it's inevitable if wherever you do something like this at the site level, it's going to have a high magnitude of landscape change. You accept that? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then for the looking at wider areas, I was interested in the reference that's been made to the drumlin landscape, and I was interested in a picture in, I think it's in the LVIA addendum, which is 003002. If you can pull that up, which I confess I didn't see. I don't think I saw when I was out on my unaccompanied site inspection. Yeah, 003002 on, I think it's PDF pages 6 and 7. It's a bump in the ground. Oh, I don't know if your version of the PDF is as bad as mine. Mine, one of the pages is upside down, which is very unfortunate. I think so. It's PDF page 7, and wait till I rotate my view so I can actually see it. There's a fairly significant bump in the ground there. I'm not a geologist, but I understand that that is a post-glacial feature in the landscape. And I know you've, Mr. Phillips, you've contrasted the scale of these proposed bumps in the landscape with the genuine features being much taller, around about 20 metres, I think, and much longer in extent, you know, much more of a landscape scale thing, whereas this is a minor bump. It struck me just, and it may just be the photograph, but it struck me that this particular landscape glacial bump was actually quite smaller in scale, and it may be if I actually go and look at it, that isn't the impression I gained, but it just struck me this photograph. It's evidence that, you know, there are lumps and bumps in the ground as a result of glacial movements that maybe are not of such dissimilar scale to what the applicant proposes and are quite prominent from roads. What would you say to that? I'm quite happy to be told I'm completely wrong, because I may well be, but what do you say to that?
I'd say you're completely wrong. I'd say, yeah, from a distance, it just looks like a little bump, but actually they're kind of 1 to 1.5 kilometres long, and they're kind of typically 20 metres high, and they're just the two that are on that kind of southwest edge of the study area. So they definitely have more of a presence and influence in the landscape. But also they've been formed naturally, so they're where they should be in the landscape. I don't think anyone's going to look at that earthworks around the Bess and think, oh, that's a drumlin. They'll think that's a bund round a Bess. So I don't think anyone will be convinced by it. And it's not even on the highest part of the ground, it's like it's slipped down onto, you know, down towards the burn. So if it's an earth bund screening the development, that's fine, but I wouldn't really try to pretend it's a drumlin.
Well, maybe unfairly suggesting that you are trying to suggest it's a bund of drumlin, but reference has been made to this being a drumlin landscape. Is it in fact that relevant, or how much does it actually help your arguments about how this fits into that landscape?
Yes, thank you, sir. So just to be clear, I'm not going to suggest that the proposed development is going to resemble a drumlin. It isn't a drumlin. What I think is worthwhile noting, though, is the grain and direction of the landform that's being proposed. So one of the features of the glacial drift and the glacial deposition, sorry, of the drumlins is they flow in the direction they deposited in the direction of the flow of the ice sheet as it melts, and effectively, and that's obviously given rise to the grain and direction of all of the local burns and the lanes. Ultimately, they all follow the same grain and direction, and the proposed development has also followed that grain. So in terms of the pattern, how it fits within the landscape, I think it does fit that landscape. I would also say, just in terms of the gradients, apart from the very top part of the southern bund there, the gradients there are not dissimilar from parts of the drumlins. So you'll be able to go and visit some of these drumlins. You can drive around some of them. There's actually really only 2 of them which are particularly prominent in the immediate vicinity of the site. The landform across the sort of 2 kilometre study area really presents itself mostly as a series of these ridges and hollows, and the roads, well, the A697 obviously goes up and down across them. The minor roads then effectively run through them, usually within the hollows. So I think, whilst we're not suggesting that we are going to create something which looks like a drumlin here, and we're not asking people to sort of be fooled by that, we're not saying it's a drumlin, but what we are saying is that it reflects the grain and direction pattern and takes its cues from the drumlins in the wider landscape.
Thank you. I think there was a drawing, maybe we could have a look at it quickly just before we break, which was at the back of the LVIA, the original one, which is 001, 002. I think I remember a very brightly coloured drawing somewhere, which showed that pattern you were talking about. I should have written the page down. It's before the photo montages. Oh, here we are. PDF page 56, I think, where I think that's showing the point you were talking about, the sort of stripy up and down of the terrain. And so your point is no more than that the orientation of your little bump is logically arranged in accordance with that kind of pattern. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes. Yeah.
Do you accept that is correct?
What I would say is that the footprint of the development has been orientated in a logical way to fit that landscape, that you would never dream of orientating it the other way, because it would really make your earthworks a massive issue. So it's a logical way. Whether the design intention from the inception was, let's align this so that it follows the pattern of the drumlins, I'm not so sure about, but definitely it's the kind of logical way that you would orientate that site.
Thank you. Okay, it's, what is it now? 25 past 11. Shall we have a short 10-minute break, come back at 25 to? Thank you. Okay, folks, thanks. Welcome back. So we turn to visual effects. If we can have a look at the photo montages, which is 008031, please. This is the latest set of visualizations. And my first layperson's question to the applicant was, are we better looking at the 50mm or the 20mm? I'm assuming it's the 50mm.
Yes, they serve different functions actually. The 20mm version presents a wider context for the view. The 50mm equivalent, it has been provided to present the information in a format which is compliant with guidance on presentation and visualization. So the 50mm equivalent is supposed to be in theory equivalent to the experience if you hold it at approximately arm's length on site.
So viewpoint 1, this is at the proposed site entrance. I'd suggested maybe this was the most obvious place from which you would see it, but I know the Councillor Phillips has pointed out, well, actually maybe not, because as Stephen said, the site is dropping down from this side, and the northern bund is in fact shallower than that from the south. So perhaps, in fact, this isn't the most potentially high visual impact location, but we'll start with this one anyway. The one point I had on this viewpoint for the council really is you're not convinced that the appearance of the access would be comparable to a farm access. I think I've seen somewhere that the applicant can correct me if I'm wrong, the proposal is to use crushed stone for the road and to, as is shown in the visualisation, to have fairly modest gates rather than the big security gate, which I think will be at the compound itself. Same with CCTV, that will be at the compound itself. Correct me if I'm wrong, rather than at the site entrance. Assuming those factors are right, Mr. Ingham hasn't jumped on me, or nobody on that side of the table has said I'm wrong, then is it fair really, Ms. Phillips, to say that this is so dissimilar to a farm access that just looking at the effects of the access itself, that it would be materially different to what you might expect from a very tidy farm?
Just winding back a little bit to the visualisations. Visualisations are never really meant to be viewed on a screen. So on this, we're looking at it, it says 100% at AO. So an AO is like a huge sheet. And I think inevitably we kind of don't print stuff off anymore, that we typically will look at stuff on screen. And so it's quite difficult to see or understand the scale of the bund, even from this northern aspect where it will be kind of slightly smaller. In terms of the farm entrance, it's kind of a detail within a bigger project. So yeah, it's going to have an impact. People travel along that road and it will be much more immediate. But to be honest, in the scale of things, it's not my biggest concern. That I think what is there kind of is relatively sensitively designed, and it is what it is. Ultimately, it's going to be an access to a Bess, and so it's going to be of a bigger dimension. There's nothing you can do about that, and I think in this respect, what the applicant's showing is okay.
I think I'd just make a couple of confirmatory points. The access track beyond the gate would be crushed stone to resemble a farm access track. And while doing construction of a certain width, once the project's up and running, it would be allowed to naturally revegetate and shrink down to a narrower form, similar to tracks you see in the area. And just a point at the site access, quite often, with reference to perception, there wouldn't be any signage of the access saying here is a big battery. It would just be as depicted here. So any clutter, on the better term, would be actually down at Bess itself.
Looking at the sort of, I think it's year 10 where you can see some of the scrub vegetation on the bund, on that end of the bund. Question for the applicant. Is the introduction of scrub planting within what was and would be expected to be a productive field not in itself somewhat incongruous, perhaps eye-catching, thinking, oh, what's that? You know, this is a prime farmland. Why is there some land being effectively wasted by having scrub on it? Is that not going to actually increase the incongruity of it?
I don't think so, no. I accept, you know, it is an arable field at the moment, but the vegetation proposes a native mix, which is frequently visible throughout the landscape. And when you view these visualizations, or as you would experience that vegetation in the wider landscape, it would become part of the layering of native hedgerows and native vegetation across that landscape. So I don't think it really stands out as a particularly incongruous form of vegetation in this landscape. It's comparable in many respects to many of the other there's woodland blocks, etc. around the landscape.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Ms. Phillips?
Yeah, again, it goes against logic in the landscape. So you would typically have scrub on thinner soils. So it's kind of incongruous in the sense that you've got prime agricultural land and scrub doesn't look appropriate in that context.
I think one point on this view is the scrub visible in this view is around the actual site entrance through the bund. This is a view where you've seen most scrub looking from the north, left of the gate. You've got the big arable field which is going to slope up to the dip down into Battery. So it's you know, it's a good view of a limited bit of scrub.
In terms of who the receptors are likely to be, there was some discussion, I think, in the submissions about the likelihood of cyclists and walkers using this being a quieter road, certainly compared with the A road that we'll talk about later on. But to what extent is it reasonable for me to assume that, given it is a quieter road, albeit, I think, as Mr. points out, perhaps not as smooth going as the main road, to what extent is it fair for me to assume that, or to assume a reasonable worst-case assumption that there will be cyclists and walkers, given that I think the evidence from local knowledge is, in fact, there aren't, certainly in terms of walkers. People don't walk along this road. You know, the fact that maybe historically that hasn't happened, is that a reason to assume, in fact, that the majority of users here will be passing by at relatively high speed in a car rather than being perhaps more susceptible walkers or cyclists? I'll start with your side of the table.
I might pass to my colleague, Mr. Ramsey, in a moment. From my personal perspective, having spent a bit of time around the area, I haven't seen anybody on either bicycles or walking those roads. That's not to say clearly it is available to people if they wish to walk those roads. Anecdotally, I don't understand that they're very well used for that purpose. Yeah, I accept they could be used for those purposes if people wanted to use them.
I very rarely see anyone walking. It's not on the way to anywhere. It's not a walking route for dog walkers. In terms of cyclists, you do occasionally see some along that road, and you equally see them on the Eccles Road, which is double width and is thus a bit safer for cyclists.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the majority of people who will get views of the site will be motorists. As you say, they're quite likely cyclists or walkers. Sometimes with LVIA, we have a viewpoint on a hilltop, and you know that there'll be very few people experiencing that view, but it's still something we assess. So it's not necessarily the quantity of people, but just making sure that we're representing all types of viewer.
I don't think we're very far apart on this. I think we both accept that they could be used by people, but I think I've said in my evidence, in my hearing statement, I've accepted that because they could be used in that way, I've accepted that they would be of medium sensitivity users. I think it's very important actually, so if I could just make one point, as we go through all of these viewpoints here, that the focus in LVIA is always on the receptors rather than on fixed viewpoints in the landscape. So although we may be focusing quite heavily on particularly the view here from the gate, it's really the experience of the people using that road for the purpose we're talking about here. So it's more about the experience of travelling along that road as a receptor. I think that's quite an important thing to focus on when we're talking about all of these viewpoints.
If you were a car driver, obviously your vehicle speeds wouldn't be that high, but this would still very much be the worst or the most prominent location. You get a snapshot if you happen to look right or left as you pass the gate, but otherwise we'd be back to looking at the effect of hedge screening at different times of the year. Except this is kind of, and that might be where I was coming from initially, this is kind of, if you're on that road, this is the point at which your impression of the site will be maximised. Do you accept that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of the other stuff you can see, you can just about see a pylon in the corner of that view, and I'll need to reach my own conclusions as to how prominent that is. There's also a few other bits and pieces, low voltage line, a telecoms line. I think the council's view was really, they're neither here nor there, they're little things that you kind of expect to see in that context, unlike the pylon, which has more significance, although I think your view is it's not an unexpected thing to see in a countryside landscape, even if not a positive thing. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think when we sometimes look at cumulatives, we weight all types of development equally, and using the pole-mounted line as an example, sometimes you can see that in a photograph, and it sometimes doesn't even register as a form of development because it's smaller scale and it's very much an established part of what you'd expect to see in a rural landscape. And so a pylon's kind of a step up from that, where you do notice it more because it's larger and it looks slightly more industrial. But then moving on to the next level up from that, you have possibly something like a wind farm or a solar farm or a Bess, where it's more permanent and larger scale development over a bigger footprint. So there's kind of a hierarchy that you need to recognise in terms of the influence on a view or on visual receptors.
Just thinking, as I have been involved with numerous pylon proposals, in terms of the amount of unhappiness that proposals, I appreciate these are new pylons as opposed to this, which is a part of the landscape you have to live with, but just in terms of the public perception of pylons, strikes me as being actually very negative and very something that people really don't want to see. Is it because this has now become part of the landscape that you think it has that lesser effect? And if so, would it not be the case that the Bess, if it were approved and it became part of the landscape, will also see, to some extent anyway, recede in people's concerns?
Yeah, I very much agree that once a development is present in the landscape, people come to accept it. I lived in Bath many years ago where they had the old gas holders, and when a proposal came up to take them out, there was public outcry because they'd become part of the townscape. So definitely, I think in many instances, people, over time, people come to accept development. I think with the development we're looking at here, the issue is the earthworks and the appearance and the location of the development appears incongruous. When we compare that to the pylon line's doing a job transporting electricity from A to B, so there's a necessity to it. You know, it has to be located along that corridor. where really the concern with this development is the inappropriateness of the location and the incongruity of the landform amidst the natural landscape, which will always exist. Yeah, maybe over time people won't be so concerned about it, but definitely it comes back to this point that none of the visuals or none of the assessment deals with the worst case scenario, which is potentially when this site is opened up and you've got the large scale earthworks, you've got all the heavy plant, and that's going to have an initial impact that will have a lasting effect on people in the local area.
I think we're straying a little bit again into perception and what people imagine is there rather than what is actually visible. We're talking here about visual effects now, I understand. So I think the focus of this discussion, I would prefer to sort of see focused on what you can actually see. There is one thing, sir, that came to my attention yesterday, which I should probably mention in relation to this viewpoint here. So the viewpoint 1 there, there's in the baseline photograph, there's a haystack in the view. And then, for obvious reasons, in the proposed view, the haystack's been removed from there. And in doing so, the visualizer has had to reconstruct a little bit of what was behind that haystack. What I personally hadn't appreciated until I went back to site yesterday and had another look at this is actually there's another 2 pylons behind that haystack there, which haven't actually appeared in that view. So you'll see this on site tomorrow, I'm sure, sir, but there's actually, there should be another 2 pylons which sits sort of directly behind there as well. It's unavoidable when you're doing this kind of work, but yeah, they are both there.
They would be criticised for artificially superimposing it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. As Mr. said, that, you need to get out in the field, which, in the absence of a piece of paper to put them out on, is a weakness. I'm not saying you need a piece, because I'm sure you haven't got a zero copy of this at hand.
I'm afraid not. The 50mm equivalent of these is supposed to be printed out at A3 actually, rather than A0. So it's the 20mm ones which are supposed to be printed out at A0. It's the A3 version. Sorry, the 50mm ones at A3. I don't actually have an A3 version with me, but we might be able to get a copy for tomorrow.
I can print A3.
Yeah.
That'd be great. That'd be handy.
Yeah.
Ultimately, imagination as to what it might end up like.
So just
to go back and, I'm sure I could go back and look at things that are visualised to see whether it actually resulted in what I thought I was going to get. But
so just to clarify, an A3 version of each of the 50mm.
yeah.
Right, I shall get printing.
Great, thank you. Nothing else on viewpoint 1 you wanted to say, or is there, Ms. Phillips?
Just a quick point to add that I'm not talking about people's perception. There were 2 things there. I was talking about the very visible construction effects, and then secondly, the very visible bund.
Okay, viewpoint 2. So this is from the main road, the 697, looking across the field. My guesstimate is it's about 200 metres from the compound at this point. It struck me that this road, while you could cycle it, or you could even walk it if you were that way inclined, is very unlikely to attract significant numbers of such users. It's a fast road, it's fairly twisty and bumpy. It's one you need to pay a lot of attention to your driving on. therefore, is it fair to assume that A, the vast majority of users here will be fast-moving cars, and B, that the point we talked about earlier about the effect of hedges even in the winter, and this kind of your inability to see through the hedge when you're looking at it at an angle means if the hedge were suitably reinforced, the actual ability to see the site would be relatively limited. Do you accept those points, Ms. Phillips?
Yeah, I accept that from this viewpoint the hedge would form an effective screen. The other points to make are further along this road there'll be an access, so that will create an opening possibly 10 metres. Sometimes with sight lines it inevitably creeps a bit beyond that, but just assuming it's 10 metres, that will give an open view. And also that little bit further on, or actually coming in the other direction when you're northbound and you kind of dip down towards the burn, and where you have no control over the land on that south side of the burn, it is more open where there's no hedgerow for a short section, and you do get a more open view. So I accept, yeah, that will be screened and you will have no effect from there. But there are other points from where you will still have an effect.
The ZTV, I don't need to go back to it, but I think my rough measuring suggested that you might, kind of worst case scenario, that there could be theoretical visibility for an extent of about 1.5 kilometres along the, does that sound the right kind of ballpark? I appreciate it ignores hedging, so it'll be on and off, but that's the extent where you'll have on and off potential glimpses. Is that about right?
I think that's correct for what the ZTV shows. Having done that exact exercise yesterday a few times, going up and down the A697, my view was that travelling southwards, you wouldn't really see the site at all until you got to the junction with the C81. And then I estimated it was 15 seconds. I actually measured it on a stopwatch as I went past. 15 seconds potentially from the point where you go past the C81 to then potentially leaving the site at the southern end. And as you travel along there, as we've talked about, the hedgerows are going to be fairly substantial along there. I think you're travelling at a direction which doesn't lead you to naturally crane your head to the right and look across. So I think travelling southwards, I think that the effect would be extremely minimal. Travelling in a northwards direction, I think even in winter months now, I think the very first time where you would catch any glimpse at all was once you were just past that John Deere unit, which I think we all know where that is. But even then, it's not really until you get towards the junction with that minor road leading down to Crosshall Farm where you do get a bit of a view from there across towards the site in winter months. But again, from that point onwards to the point where you pass the C81, it's about 30 seconds. So again, I think it's a very transient and temporary effect. Well, it's not temporary in terms of the duration of the scheme. So I mean, it's a transient, short effect that you're experiencing as you drive past the scheme there at speed. So obviously, it's you know, I was doing it at probably 50 miles an hour. So
it'll probably come up more clearly on the next viewpoint, I think. But there was along the burn, I think there's a proposal to reinforce some of the existing tree planting, but not massively. I'm not expressing a view as to whether that's a good or a bad thing. I just noted there was no intention clearly to provide any kind of very dense corridor of trees along the burn. Is that for technical reasons or for design reasons, or and just in terms of Ms. Phillips' point that well, as you approach from the John Deere side heading north, and then as you get to the point where you cross the burn, if you happen to look left over the top of the burn, you're not proposing a massive amount of planting along the burn. Is there a reason for that?
I think it's probably worth just stopping to consider the actual landscape plan, because it has changed a few times, and the most recent version of that plan, it's document 003.005. called the Amended Landscape Strategy and Planting Plan.
That may I'm comparing that, and well, you can tell me what it says, but that looks rather more dense Burnside planting than I got the impression of from the visualisations, and that might just be me, or or it might be that this is perhaps overtaking the event slightly. Maybe you can explain it.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, as we can see there, what there is a proposal to strengthen the hedgerows and plant a series of standard trees along there. So I'm afraid I can't count the number of it off the top of my head, but I think in total there were approximately 200 trees, and if you imagine that's spread around effectively 3 sides, a guess would be somewhere in the region of 50 to 60 trees planted along that edge there. But I think in terms of a more dense screen along that edge there, my understanding was, I wasn't involved in the earlier stages of this application, but there were originally proposals to plant more there, but it was actually a pushback from the council that led to a redesign of this landscape scheme here. I don't know if Mr. Ramsey wants to elaborate on that.
I was just going to address that southern edge along the burn, which has intermittent trees currently. It doesn't have a hedge, and I considered planting a hedge for screening, but actually the eye level as you come down the hill, the hedge would have no impact in screening that ahead of you, whereas filling in with more trees, the gaps, would provide screening.
It may just be me, and there may be no disparity between that planting plan and the next visualisation, which we'll come to, number 3. I think it just struck me that it was still quite gappy, less gappy than it is at the moment. But that there was no intention certainly to provide a sort of continuous wall of trees. Although looking at it now, it may in fact be entirely accurate. There are more trees there in the visualisation from viewpoint 3 than I recalled, but still, there's no attempt to provide some sort of impenetrable screen down there. I think that's pretty fair.
No, it wasn't. It's not the intention to provide, as you say, an impenetrable screen. Yeah.
Unless you've got anything else on viewpoint 2, Ms. Phillips, maybe, as I've kind of jumped ahead anyway. But.
Yeah, just briefly, I would agree that the effects along the A697 would be very localised, but also just to make the point that it's a very well-travelled route, that it's the kind of connection between Coldstream and Edinburgh, so there's a concentration of traffic along that route. Just in terms of the tree planting along the burn, we're very much at the lowest point in the landscape. So typically when we think about growth rates for trees in this kind of context, we would apply a sort of 15-year to get to something like 7.5 metres. So there will be a lag in terms of the effectiveness of any of the tree planting around the site. Yeah, you've got a hedge that's existing, that's kind of helpful in that that's already there. But if we're looking at the additional screening that tree planting would contribute, it would be more a medium-term benefit.
Just to clarify a point about the trees that are proposed along there. So the second page in the it was document 003005 sets out a planting schedule. So those trees proposed there are 250 to 300 centimetre trees. So with planting of that nature, it would probably reach 7.5 metres a little bit before 15 years, though, I would suggest. I think.
You got a view on that, Ms. Phillips?
Yeah, just typically there's pros and cons, and for a lot of projects where you're trying to create a screen, whips are the preference, which are small, and the reason being that if you start them from a young age, they actually ultimately grow faster and they're quite often better established than trying to put in bigger trees. But like you say, the bigger trees might in that kind of short term give you a little bit more of a screen, but will typically grow slower. So pros and cons.
I think the intention would be a mixture of both, as fits all the conditions and the plans. So, some standards for immediate visual effect and whips, as pointed out for sort of longevity and sort of a better establishment. Plus, in terms of hedges, gorse and broom, which are, far growing and quite dense. So, I think quite a bit of kind of attention would go into the species mix.
Other points I'd thought about in relation to this view we've really covered already, which is it's obviously the junction with the minor road. So on that minor road, there's the issue again about potential for it to be used by more susceptible receptors, cyclists, walkers, etc., versus whether there's actual evidence that they do so. I don't think we need to cover that again. We've heard the council's point about this being a break from the built development elsewhere, so there's an increased susceptibility of the receptor for that point of view. Again, I think we've covered that point. So I think, unless anyone's got anything else on number 3, I was going to move on to number 4. Anything you want to say, Ms. Phillips? 3.3.
The only point to make is this view opens up a little bit more. So whilst you've still got a hedgerow running along the minor road, it's kind of a more natural orientation to look over the landscape to that facing valley side. And at that point, you'll see the full horizontal extent of the development, which you don't necessarily from other aspects around the site.
I don't disagree in so much as there is a slightly more open view from that minor road there. It's about 350 to 400 metres from the site. So, but I do accept that there are a few more gaps along that hedgerow there where there would be views across.
Good. Okay, 3.4, which is from the farm, Crosshall Farm. My measurement is it's about 600 metres or so from the site at this point. We've got a very prominent pylon, about 90 metres in front. An obvious question is, in the context of that pylon, which I appreciate it's probably been there for a long time, but in the context of that, how significant would be the effect of the Bess, or the bund, the southern steepest bund, at a distance of about 600 metres on receptors, both residential, because obviously there are residential here, and also road users. I'll start with Ms. Phillips.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. If we look at that view and we imagine that tower isn't there, does that make the magnitude of change higher or lower? And I would argue with the tower there, it makes the magnitude of change higher because although that's baseline, and I know quite often cumulatives is separated out, but we have a cumulative effect here. So we've got the pylon line plus the Bess. So rather than suggesting that the presence of that tower reduces the magnitude of change, I'd say in this instance, seeing both in combination has the effect of increasing the potential impact of the Bess.
Yeah, I mean, I do disagree again. This comes back, I think, to our interpretation of how we deal with these pylons in the landscape. I agree that the infrastructure proposed adds to an existing effect at that location. But I think the additional effect that can be attributed to the best proposal at this location is very small compared when you put it in the context of that pylon which sits there and does have a fairly important defining influence on that view already. So I think the effect there, as I've stated, I accept it's a minor adverse effect, but in the context of that pylon there, I don't think you could rate it any higher than that.
Is there anything else for viewpoint 4 that you wanted to raise, Ms. Phillips?
Just following on from, you know, this idea of magnitude of change, then you could project that idea and say, yeah, we've got a BES in there and it's kind of fairly well screened, but would that be the end of it, or would that be the start of more developments coming into this area to form a cluster similar to what you've got Echoes? And I know that's not a concern for the applicant, but it's a concern for Scottish Borders Council.
Come back as to whether that...
I think the key point there is that it's not a matter for this application. None of us can predict what's going to happen in the future, and we certainly can't assess that as part of this scheme. So, with respect to I don't dismiss any concerns that the community may have in that regard, but at the same time, that is a matter for any future development to consider. It's not a matter for this, for the Scottish Ministers to consider in this application, I don't believe.
So the last item I wanted to talk about, and we've touched on it to some extent already, was cumulative effects. We've, I think, agreed that you wouldn't have simultaneous visibility of the BES plus the other BESs and the substation, but Council's concern is about sequential effects for anyone travelling through the landscape. I had a question on the laundry field proposal, or possibly proposals, because somewhere I thought I'd read that there was more than one, but I may have made a mistake there. But I think I'm right in saying laundry field is some way further back down the consenting process. I think it's an application, or is it still at scoping?
So my understanding of the situation is that there was a screening request submitted, but that there has not been any further scoping or application. The council may know differently, but that was just what I've established from the council's planning portal.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. Yeah, there's been a screening request for a BES and I believe a data centre as well in the laundry field. But up until this stage, they've not proceeded in the planning process. There's been no further engagement with either of those type of developments.
Thank you, that's helpful. I thought I hadn't imagined the word data centre. It stuck in my mind. But, so, would you agree, I suppose, for you, Mr. Chair, really, given its stage in the long pipeline of getting to a decision, that in terms of the decision ministers must take on this scheme, the amount of weight they can give to that is somewhat reduced, because if this were to go ahead, then that would be assessed in the light of this scheme, given it's that much further back down the pipeline.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair, to be honest. Yeah, it seems very much still in its infancy, as far as we are aware. There doesn't seem to be any recent pressure for that one either. So yeah, no, I think that is fair. I think our key kind of cumulative assessment is really based on kind of what is happening in and around the Echoes substation itself. And in addition, we've got the Bishop Dal site as well, which we're awaiting determination from the consent unit on, but that's one that the council have not objected to.
And that one is within that sort of substation cluster, is it?
Yes, yes, it is. Yeah, it is. It's directly opposite the existing substation, so on the same side of the road as the, well, what is the Zenobia? So that was the first BES site. But yeah, that would be the kind of fourth one in that cluster.
I think just one further point. We understand that the laundry field, Bess, and the data center occupy the same site. Is that correct? There's two. I think it's two. You know, two overlapping, two alternatives. Yes.
Right, well, I had nothing more on my pieces of paper to talk about. You may disagree, there may be other things you want to talk about. I'll turn first to the council. If there's anything else you want to bring up, please let me know.
Nothing further from the council at this time, thank you.
The only point from us, sir, as you'd mentioned earlier about the site visit, and Mr Hope had proposed some items for the itinerary. Quite happy to accommodate those. So, yeah.
Okay, turn my microphone. Thank you all very much. That was very, very helpful. So, in terms of the site visit, tomorrow, 2 o'clock, meet here. I don't know who's coming. Mr Hope and I think Mr Finney were intending to, certainly Mr Hope, he was suggesting doing it in 2 cars. I don't know whose cars. I'm not offering my car. So if somebody could drive me, I mean the drill, as I'm sure you know, is usually me plus somebody from either side of the argument, and then anyone else is willing to come along as well, and we'll hopefully all reconvene at various points along the route. So we've agreed what that route is. But if we kick off from here at 2 o'clock, that'd be good.
Certainly, sir. I'm more than happy to drive a number of people about tomorrow.
Okay, so I will see some of you anyway on site tomorrow 2 o'clock, or here 2 o'clock, and then 6 o'clock for the community session. I think we don't have that many speakers, so it may not be a very long community session, but that starts at 6 o'clock anyway. But thank you all very much. That was really, really helpful for me. Thank you all.